Welcome back everyone. We get to talk about another Android phone this time around, and it is actually the Google Pixel 3. Now this phone is a very interesting device. It sits in a very interesting spot as well, and this phone came out in 2018, so many years ago, back in 4 years ago, which is so crazy. And when this phone came out, the Pixel 3 was honestly a pretty decent phone. It just so happened that the Google Pixel 3 XL was a very strange device. I don't really know what Google was thinking with that one. It just seemed like a slap in the face for everybody who was supporting the Pixel lineup. But the Pixel 3 was more of a normal phone, which I actually did like. So at least they kind of, did something good with this one, although they kind of butchered the Pixel 3 XL. Now with the Pixel 3 on the front, if you want to buy this phone, I would kind of recommend it to some people, but I would highly recommend buying like a Pixel 5, Pixel 5a, a Pixel 6, and I'll leave those phones linked in the description. You can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. Now on the front of the Google Pixel 3, we have a 5.5-inch POLED display. It's a 1080p panel, and overall, it's a really good looking panel. I really don't think this is an ugly looking phone by any means. You have a front facing speaker set, which is really cool, and although this phone doesn't have like a 90Hz panel or anything that we have nowadays, a good thing that the Pixel 4 brought was that 90Hz panel, but this thing still looks good, and I really don't have too many complaints about this panel by any means. Now we do have a USB Type-C port on this thing, which is great. No headphone jack, which is kind of expected as at this point. And on the back, we had this aluminum framed back that was kind of like a glass back too, which is very interesting. It didn't really feel like the most premium phone of all time at that point, and that's something Google has kind of done. They did the same thing with the Pixel 5, and I think they did the same thing with the Pixel 4 as well. It's a very strange layout. I don't think it feels cheap, it just feels extremely different. And with the Pixel 6, they finally have taken the approach of what they used to do with like the Nexus 4 and everything, and they made that phone feel extremely premium, and I'm so happy they did that. The Pixel 3 on the other hand, very strange device. It doesn't feel cheap, but I feel like they could have done a better job in terms of the body. We also have that single camera setup on the back as well, which doesn't really, doesn't look bad either. And I will tell you, this phone, even though it came out in 2018, it still looks pretty decent. It doesn't look ugly, it doesn't look dated. It definitely doesn't look like the most brand new phone of all time. Even the Pixel 4a looks much better than this one, but I do think it looks pretty decent, and I'm definitely a fan of it for sure. Now in terms of the camera setup, like I mentioned, this thing has that single camera on the back. It's a 12.2 megapixel wide-angle lens, and on the front you have a kind of a dual camera setup. You have an 8 megapixel wide and 8 megapixel ultra wide. Since then, Google hasn't really added any additional sensors on the front, which is very weird. Very similar to how Samsung on the S10 Plus added that extra camera on the front, and since then they never really did anything with it, which is a very interesting thing. Now with the Google Pixel 3, one thing I really do appreciate is that Google really focused in on the camera quality of pretty much their entire Pixel lineup. They wanted this specific lineup to have some of the best camera quality of all time, and I still think that's completely the case. I think their cameras are still really good, but at this time, we kind of expected Google to have really good camera quality, and one thing that Google kept kind of flopping at was adding extra camera sensors. They didn't add an additional telephoto lens or ultra-wide camera to the back, they added it to the front, which I think was a very interesting move. And with something like the Google Pixel 3, I feel like Google, if they just added an extra ultra-wide sensor at this time, that would have been awesome. You have to look at some other phones that came out around this time too. We had the iPhone XS and XS Max that had a dual camera setup. The Galaxy Note 8 and Note 9 both had dual camera setups as well. So I really do think Google could have done a better job here. It is what it is, there's nothing we can do about it. Although the camera quality was still pretty good, and I'm a fan of the camera quality for sure. I feel like Google could have done a better job, and it was just one of those things that I feel like, had Google done a better job at this time, it would have really set themselves up for a much bigger success for this specific lineup. I feel like the Pixel 3 and Pixel 4 are kind of those lineups that people kind of skip over in my opinion. So in terms of that kind of covers up the camera, to be honest. Now in terms of the longevity of this phone, one of the best things about this device is that it pretty much will last a very long time, for Android. Now it's could last a very long time starting back in 2018, and right now it's kind of on its last leg. Like I mentioned before, it's not really going to be lasting like 30,000 years longer. It's going to be at a tipping point at some point, and I do think with something like the Pixel 3, it really just depends on how you're going to look at it. I think the Google Pixel 3, could have easily gotten like 30 more versions of Android. It's very capable machine, but even it ending off at Android 12, I mean, that's not a bad version of Android for this thing to end off. And if it gets, custom ROMs on Android 13 and 14 and 15 and 16, I mean, those are really good, strong characteristics of a Google Pixel phone. I mean, these things can last forever. And that is one of my favorite things about these devices. You can literally pick up a Pixel phone from 2015 or 16, the original Google Pixel, and that thing will still have a strong life in terms of custom ROMs and everything. So in my experience, whenever I go ahead and buy any type of Google Pixel, one of my favorite things is the updates. I know this thing will last a very long time, and even if I go ahead and try to custom ROM it or anything like that, I know that whether I do or not, or if I don't feel like it, there still is such a strong community behind this phone, just in terms of the stock software, that Google isn't going to let this thing just die down. And because of that, I feel really comfortable buying a Google Pixel for sure. And now that a lot of these Android manufacturers are increasing their software longevity, that just makes me so happy. And I'm just so happy about the Google Pixel lineup for sure. So in terms of that, I mean, I'll definitely tell you it's not lasting like a super long time anymore. If you're willing to custom ROM it, then you're in a better situation. But I'm a fan of this, phone, and I think it's a thumbs up for me for sure. Now in terms of performance, this device has that Qualcomm Snapdragon 845 chipset inside of it, an Adreno 630 GPU, and 4GB of RAM on pretty much both the models that this phone had. And as I mentioned before, I mean, this phone's performance is still pretty decent. One thing I've been saying is that, with something like the, Google Pixel lineup, Google did a great job at keeping that stock software, and because of that, it kind of made the phone feel a little bit better in terms of performance compared to other phones that came out at the same time. The Galaxy S9 came out the same year, and although I think that's a more powerful phone, this phone kind of feels a little bit smoother here and there, which is something I really like seeing. I can say the same thing about, the iPhones of this year. The iPhones always feel faster and smoother than pretty much any other phone, and that's because of the stock software. And the Pixels are almost like the iPhones for Android, which is really cool. And I will definitely tell you that, Pixel 3 is still a pretty decent performing phone. Is it amazing? No, I mean, I think some things that are kind of lacking with it, like I mentioned, is the additional amount of RAM. I mean, nowadays we have like 8GB of RAM on the base models of a lot of phones, and this one had 4, which is still good enough. But you also don't have like a 120Hz panel, which is like one of the most important things about phones nowadays. Although it doesn't make the phone faster, it makes the phone feel so much faster, and that is one of my favorite things about this phone too. I mean, and that is one of my favorite things about the latest phones that this one doesn't really have. So that's another thing to keep in mind. I think something like the Pixel 3 sits in the same line as something like the Pixel 2 and the Pixel 1. I mean, it just isn't really like a phone you're going to remember for that year, but a lot of people will remember the Note 9, the Galaxy S9, the iPhone XS and XS Max. People don't really remember the Pixel lineup of this year, which is very interesting, but it makes sense. So in terms of performance, that covers it up. In terms of battery, this thing has a 2,915 mAh battery, and that's a pretty decent battery size for a stock Android phone. Nowadays, that's very low, but at that point, it was probably pretty decent. So it's another thing to keep in mind. And to be honest, I think the Google Pixel 3 is still a very interesting phone in 2022. I don't think it's necessarily like the best phone to pick up, but I don't think it's the worst one either. I think if you want to go buy a phone and, if you like stock software, if you want to just get a phone and pretty much move on with your life, this isn't like a horrible option, and I do think it could be worse, but just do keep in mind that sooner than later you're going to buy this phone and it's going to be outdated with software, and you're going to probably want to go pick up something like the latest Pixel or the latest Samsung just because of the amount of features within them. You will not believe how many more features we have with the latest phones, and with something like this, I don't think it's a bad phone, I don't think it's anything like that, but I do think Google could have done a better job at this point, and I do think they will probably end up doing a lot better in the future, and that's why I would probably recommend buying one of the newer phones, because the software is definitely going to be getting so much better for sure. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. If you guys have any other questions or anything, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.